Hi, everyone, and thanks for coming today. Your webinar today is Layouts in GUI, presented by Greg McCarville. Just wanted to mention that next week we'll be having another webinar, a little bit different than the usual. Laurent Rebardier will actually be here live, and we'll be doing an interview with him. So you'll be receiving an email on how to sign up for that one for next Thursday. As usual, if you have any questions, please just use the question function with the Citrix question function to the top right of your screen, and we'll get to those at the end of the webinar. And with that said, I'll hand it over to Greg.
Thanks, Bill. Got a good webinar for you today. Going to be working with layouts, giving you some best practices and some tips. We're trying, obviously, as you can tell, with the frequency of webinars as of late, we're trying to get you a nice quantity of information out there. Not so concerned about the presentation polish, or we would be putting out screencasts. So, you know, this is a casual presentation, more or less as if I was sitting at your desk and sharing with you directly. We're going to go through a lot of information today, not quite as much code as the last one. Now, on the last screencast, we did have some recording issues. There seems to be issues with the webinar software. This is our second package. We'll have it nailed down today for sure, but I'm going to be recording a screencast later today, going through the content from the last webinar so that it can be posted. So that should be up and ready before the weekend or early next week. Like Bill said, the next webinar is going to be a must-see. Question and answer is going to have Laurent and I believe Ricardo Mello, who's the product director for Wakanda, and we're gathering questions for those for that question and answer presentation. There's a thread on the forum right now where you can get the contact information to submit those questions. It's in the general section. Definitely want your feedback, what you want asked, and I'm going to culminate those into a number of questions that make the most sense and represent most people's wishes. We will be taking questions live as well, but I'd like to have some pre-prepared ones so that they can prepare some more deeply thought out answers. So let's get into this webinar. So the learning agenda today, we're going to be looking at the qualities of a proper business application layout, the fundamental layout tools and structures to put that together. We're going to look at constraint-based layouts and sizing, containers and splitters. We're going to look at some Widget API functions that relate to layout and to the interface in general. We're going to go through widget skins and the basics of CSS and how it integrates with the generated CSS that Wakanda Studio builds. And we're going to talk about jQuery and some of the ways that you can use jQuery to enhance your interface and layouts that may not be available in Wakanda natively yet. So for the new people, here's Wakanda. I want to introduce you quickly to Wakanda. It's a full JavaScript stack with a NoSQL object data store. It includes a fully featured IDE. It's called Wakanda Studio. It is free. This is a very unique thing with Wakanda. I don't know of any other graphical IDEs that are offered in the competitive landscape. It's focused on helping you build business web applications. So it's data-centric applications, you know, where it's heavy on data, it's heavy on relationships and related data. Got a really active community. You'll see that if you go to the forum, and there's a lot of help and a lot of people willing to help you assist you in getting started. And it is an open source project, which is nice. Most people like that. So let's talk what makes a great business app layout. There's a few main points here. I think one that's very important is it's flexible with respect to screen resolution. For instance, here I'm presenting on a 1080p monitor. Not everyone has that resolution. Some people have more. It depends on the hardware that particular user has. So I think it's important to be able to adjust for size. inside of that too is browser windows can be sized depending on people's preferences. So you need to keep that in your thoughts as you're building these. I think a complete yet uncluttered display is important. You want to present the information that's needed, but not so much that you're blowing people out and making your layouts unreadable and not friendly. Less page loads or no page loads. So I think, people expect now for dynamic updating, a lot of, Wakanda gives you all the tools you need to even make a single paged application where you're loading full interface in and out dynamically. There are certain places where it makes sense to load a new page, but you have that flexibility with Wakanda. It employs standard UI conventions. You don't want to go off the path of what people expect in a user interface unless you need to. If you're doing something that's not been standardized, by all means, get creative and implement the best UI you can. But if there's a standard there, do stick to it. It makes it your application have less of a learning curve. It needs to be highly responsive, and we're going to be building a lot of interfaces that feel and look like a desktop application in comparison to the traditional website. And if you're building a web app, it needs to use web standards. There was tools such as Adobe Flex that used Flash Player and did a good job of it, but that ended up being, in my opinion, one of its big downfalls was that it was based on Flash Player. So the first topic we're going to cover is containers and constraint-based layout. It's the foundation of all good layouts. It allows you, grouping and sizing largely relies on containers. You'll see containers as a super fundamental part of creating good layouts. Constraints allow you to develop for, like we were talking about, those multiple resolutions and multiple browser window sizes. And it helps you provide a desktop application look and feel. Containers aren't necessarily always visual elements either. And I'll show you exactly what I mean in this demonstration. So I'm switching over to Wakanda Studio. You can see here, typically I've been using, just got to find my mouse here. Okay, typically I've been using, for this webinar, I'm using the dev branch because there was some improvements to the CSS that's generated, makes it it's an improvement, and it will be improving going forward as well. Just to mention, the project and solution from this webinar are on my GitHub. I'll be committing that at the end of this presentation as well when it's all filled in or all completed. So first place we're going to go is we're going to go to layouts and to this page called containers. Let's start from the real basics. How do you make a container? Step one, you can drag and create a container. Of course, you can resize once you get it on. Next, you can double click and create a container, or you can click once, drag, and size. So that's how you create a container. Well, the big benefit for containers, I'm going to add some widgets. You can see that it highlights when I'm going to be adding a widget as a child to that container. And perhaps this is a save button. And we'll grab some text inputs. We'll just create a, maybe a quick form. The big benefit of containers is they group things, and you can drag and place based on that group. If you hold Shift and drag, you can select within the container a group, and you can see that allows you to compartmentalize your layout and makes it very easy that way. One example of container use is if we drag on this data source called person and create a form, you can see the first thing it does is it outlines everything in a container. So let's go to the browser. I'm just going to save this and run it. So what are the other benefits of a container? Bringing up the JavaScript console, a few of the items in the Widget API. So this form here is container 3. You can see the ID. So let's work with that. We could go the Wakanda reference to container 3. Oops. Dot hide, for instance. It'll hide the container and all of its child elements. You can show. And another interesting one is we can do a disable. And this is particularly useful for forms. Sorry, spelled that wrong. And you can see all the child elements are now disabled, and it's good for forms that way. So that's the big benefits of containers is that right there, grouping. It allows you to segment your application. Like I said, these all have default styling to them. We're going to do some examples of basically invisible containers. So they're used strictly for layout. One other interesting aspect of containers, let's put these over here for now. We'll make a new container. So this is container 4, is we can split containers. So go to an outline, you see container 4 here. I'll go right click, split vertically. And you'll see what's happened in the outline is it's created 2 child containers, 5 and 6, and added a splitter. Now just for making it easy to see what's happening, let's slightly color one side there. We'll save it. I'm going to reload in the browser. We can get rid of this. And you can see, so now we have a container that has a splitter that you can resize. Now that's good for perhaps you have a dashboard or some other navigation. Let's say, for instance, here's the one limitation right now. I'm going to show you a solution to it later. Is what if we wanted a right anchor, splitter anchored to the right side? Well, we could do this, and let's make it, just so I can demonstrate this even better, let's make this outer container resizable. I'll save. I'm going to reload in the browser. So now we have it anchored to the right. However, when we resize, you can see it's not truly anchored to the right. I'm going to show you a solution using jQuery towards the end of this presentation. So that's splitters. So there's containers in a nutshell. We're going to go into more depth, obviously, with different topics, but we'll go into constraint-based layouts now. So what I'm going to do is basically let's take a look at this previous example. As I size the window, there's no movement. It's a static layout. It doesn't respond to a browser resize, but we're going to build something that does. So grab a container, and let's make this somewhat, say, a header. And where we find constraints, so this is container 1, we go into size and position, and you can see constraints here. It's a graphical interface for you. And the way you can think of this is when you select a constraint, it's basically telling that widget to scale basically this side to stick. So here I've specified it to stick on left and right and the top. So when I save that, and we'll run this page, you can see now it's scaling from side to side with the size of my browser window. And this is a lot more responsive. And again, it allows people to choose the preference of window size they wish and still keeps an excellent layout. We can go a little further with this. Let's go to, we'll bring another container here. I'm going to size it pretty much to the size of the window, or the remainder of the window. Actually, we'll leave a little spot at the bottom here. And for this one, I actually want it to grow in all directions. We'll put a container at the bottom here. Now that's the other thing, you got to watch it. When it highlights, it means you're going to drop it inside. So this container is now a child. I don't actually want this to be a child container, so I'm going to put it outside and towards the bottom. And this one we're going to go to Styles, Constraints, and we're going to do the opposite of what we did with the header. We're going to not constrain to the top, but constrain to the other 3 sides. So if we save this and take a look at how the layout responds now, when we resize, you can see that the bottom container scales horizontally, but sticks to the bottom. the header the opposite, and the center container scales dynamically with the size of the browser window as well. Let's take a grid. You can do the same type of constraints with widgets. So let's take a grid. Just put this person. I don't have any data in the person data source. I'll just make it look a little better. We'll go to styles. Again, the same place in size and position. We can do this. And so this will now stretch all four sides. It's going to fill this window. However, let's put in here, say we wanted to put even at the top, a search field or something like that. Now, what we would want to do with this is probably keep it anchored to this side, which it is by default, but just for illustration purposes, let's put it to the right, and we'll select just it to anchor to the top and to the right. So we'll save, reload. Now you can see we've got the widget scaling and the search staying to the right side, and you can get into a lot of really nice flexible layouts this way. Now here's one other interesting aspect. Let's take a container, and I'm going to put it on the page. And what I'm going to do, sorry, I'm trying to get this so it's not a child. And I'm going to put inside of this container an image widget. So by default, you'll see here when I demonstrate, images will hide oversized widgets. So I'm making this large on purpose. Now I didn't get that inside of there properly, I don't think. Hold on, something's not working for me here. Bear with me, I'm going to do that again. So make a container. We'll drag this image widget inside of the container. And of course, it's not working for me. Let me just size this down. Okay, so I'll look at that later and see if there's an issue I need to report, or I might be doing something wrong. Image widget. Okay, there. So now it's working. We're going to put the source here. I'm going to take it. I have an image in my image folder. Let's take image 1. And I'm making sure that it's sized to the container. So the image is actually filling up this entire space. However, as you're going to see in the browser, we can't see the entire image. Now here's something you can do to alleviate that, is we're going to add a little custom CSS to the application.css. And let me get the ID of that container, container 6. So we're going to add container 6 ID as the selector, and we're going to put overflow auto. When we do that, so a container hides by default content that falls outside of its boundaries. When I reload, you'll see now, I'm not a big fan of how Mac OS does this with the scroll bars, but you can see I can now scroll and see the entire image. So this is useful if you have PDFs or images. You can do this with containers. I'm going to show you how to do it on a browser window level as well later on in the presentation. So this is called overflow. I think it's an important thing to know as you move forward. So that's constraint-based layouts. I think you've got a good idea how you can make your layouts flexible and dynamic and usable on a number of different browser window sizes. So I'll close that out. And we'll go back to the slides. The next topic we're going to cover is custom CSS. So CSS, hopefully a lot of you are familiar with how it works. CSS is how it works with Wakanda is something you need to know. You need to understand the generated CSS in order to work with it, which is understandable. You have existing CSS. Essentially, if you want to overwrite CSS that's created by Wakanda Studio, you need to know how that generated CSS works. So we're going to cover that a little bit. CSS is used for styling widgets, sizing different elements, and a lot more. Widget skins and themes rely on CSS. We'll be looking at inline. Well, I guess inline I'm not going to cover too much today, but inline and external CSS have their place in Wakanda. You likely won't use embedded CSS because of the fact that the HTML pages are generated, but inline and external have different uses. And this is specific to the dev branch. It was improved versus version 3. Not drastically, but if you are using version 3, there's some different selectors that are used in the generated CSS that you'll need to compensate for. So let's look at CSS. So we'll open the first custom CSS, and let's look at first how Wakanda generates CSS. So I'm going to drag a button on, just for lack of better example, and we'll create some styles. Let's just make a border. We'll make it a really ugly color so we can see it. It's not that ugly, but and we'll make it 3 wide, and that's all we're doing to it. So I'm going to save. You'll see inside of the page folder there's a styles folder with index.css, and this is the styles for this page that were generated. Don't modify this file. It is generated by Wakanda Studio, so everything you change will be overwritten. But you'll see here there's 5 elements that are there by default: width, height, top left, and position. And these following items, I just modified it, but it's going to get overwritten. These items were generated by Studio when we added the border. So the important thing to see here is the selector that's being used. It's an ID selector based on the ID of that widget. Why that's important is there's a concept in CSS called specificity. I should spell it for you because I apparently can't say it. However, basically different types of CSS selectors have different weights, so to speak. ID selectors have a very high weight. So say, for instance, we wanted to change the width and height of this button using an external CSS sheet. Now I'm going to use application.css just because it's there and ready for me. You can embed custom CSS at different levels by the page, anywhere you like really, and embed those into a page. I'm going to put the code in here. So let's take, for instance, I wanted to create a CSS class called button 100, and those are going to be buttons. Well, let's see how they're 22 high by default, and these are going to make buttons that are 100 pixels high. So height is 100 pixels, and let's go into Studio, select this button, and we'll put in, what did I call it again? Button 100 as its class. Now you see it changed the generated CSS, that's why that came up. Let's run this page. And you'll see we got the green outline, but it's not 100 high. If we go to the JavaScript console and look at that element, you'll see that it has match styles here, and essentially our CSS selector was overpowered by the ID selector here. So there's a way around this. If you look at the source completely, every Wakanda application has a body with an ID WAF-body. So this is going to be something you'll see me do a few times here. Close that, and what we're going to do is in the CSS we created, we're going to prepend the class with WAF body space. And when we save that and reload, that still didn't work. Oh, sorry, because I missed my hash. So now we have an ID selector plus a class selector, which is going to give it more precedence over the single ID selector. And now you'll see that the items we specified in that class now take precedence. So that's a tip on how to override the default elements that were created by Wakanda Studio. So that's that topic. I'm going to create a class that I'm going to use a few times here. Get rid of that button. I'm going to make a style on a container, and I want an invisible container. So what I need to do, it gets styles by default. So I'm going to go in here, transparent background color, border, 0 width. I don't want corners. The background color I want to be transparent as well, and I don't want a drop shadow. So I'll make that transparent 0, 0. Okay, so I have a container that's invisible. I'll save that. I'm going to take this style that was generated. So you remember it's generated in this index.css. So here's the container. Here's all of the elements that made that invisible. So I'm going to copy that and go into application.css, and I'm going to make a class. I'm going to make it clear container. And we'll just paste in the code from that other container that is invisible. Now, because none of these attributes are, basically there's those 5 attributes that are put in by Studio by default, I don't think we need to prepend with the WAF body, and we'll still get the invisible effect unless we overwrite it with the properties panel. So this will work without the prepend, but let's verify. So if we go into the page now, let's clear all the styles off of this container. So now we have container. In the index CSS, you can see only the 5 properties by default are there. So we're going to add that CSS class to this container. So it's clear container. We'll save that. Go back to our browser and reload. Okay, I think I do need the let's put in the WAF body and reload. Okay, so now we have a clear container, and you can see it is there. It just has styling that makes it clear. So we're going to use this later on. And that's just to show you that containers don't always need to have a visual element to them. Quite often, in fact, you use them strictly for layout and nothing more. Now, if we go, let's go back to, I'm going to try something here. We'll select the container. I'm going to take out the CSS class in Wakanda Studio, save it, and we'll go back into the browser, refresh. We'll now see the container. I'm going to go to the console. That container is container 1. So we're going to go the Wakanda reference to container 1 dot add class, and we'll pass in clear container. Oops. Close my. So there, we've added it dynamically, and likewise we can remove class. And I'm going to go through more of these API, Widget API calls later down the road, but you can see this is just one quick example of how you can have things happen on the fly. You could call this function in a button or in a different event anywhere. So that's add and remove class. The next thing I'm going to show you is something called percentage-based layouts. And it has to do with CSS, so I've got it in the same section here. So let's go to percentage widths. I've got a layout here, and I have 1, 2, 3 invisible widgets. You can see they are named demo 1, 2, and 3 for the IDs, and I have the clear container class assigned to them. So by default, let's say we wanted to add a few text inputs to the top of this form. Maybe it's first name, last name, and full name if we're working with people. So I'm going to go first name. And person dot first name from the data source. And this binding doesn't really matter. It's more visual. So I'm just going to do the labels, and this would be full name. Okay, so that looks fine here. If we go to the browser, let's run this page. You can see it looks okay, but what are we missing? We're missing the flexible layout. So how would we solve this in Studio? Well, we could try one thing. We could change our constraints on each of these to constrain width-wise. And I'll show you this is not the way to do it, but I want to show you why. So if we save that and reload, you'll see it looks pretty good. However, they're all going to size with the browser window, so it's not the effect you're looking for. What I'm looking for is something that will fill across here nicely, not create overlaps, and take advantage of this full screen. For instance, if you have a really small screen, maybe the names get truncated, but if you've got a nice big monitor, you shouldn't have to see that truncated information. So we're going to implement this. We're going to use these clear containers as a tool to do that. So we have demo 1, 2, and 3. I'm going to grab the text input here and put it inside of this container. Now remember, this has constraints set already to both sides, so it's going to grow with whatever this container does, because constraints are based on the parent, as you've seen. It's not based on the page. So as we're putting these inside of the container, they're going to size according to the container, but we can set totally different rules to the containers themselves. So we're going to grab each of these clear containers, pull them up to the header, and now we're going to get into some custom CSS and see if we can get this working properly. So we'll go to application.css, and below clear container, we're going to add one called, so we'll prepend it with WAF body, and we'll call this class thirds. This is going to be the first element of a group of 3. So we could create quarters, we could do whatever we want. I'm going to make this generic, so not only will it apply to this circumstance, I could use it in any circumstance where I have 3 items that I want spaced horizontally evenly. So we're going to specify 2 things. We're going to specify the left, 0 pixels on the first one, and the width, well, 100 divided by 3 is roughly 33%. So Studio doesn't allow you to put in percentage-based widths as of yet. So this is the way we're working around it. Now we have 3 parts here. We need a different rule for each of the thirds because they each have different left values. So the left value on the first one, or the second one, will be 33%. Call that thirds part 2. This will be thirds part 3, and the left will be 66%. So that's our CSS. Now we need to apply it to those containers. So it's demo 1, demo 2, and demo 3. So the best place to probably do this is in events in the onload. As soon as the page is ready to go, we'll get the reference to demo 1, dot add class, and we'll add thirds1. And we can copy and paste that a few times. And demo2 is thirds2, and demo3 is thirds3. I'll save that, go back to the browser, reload, and now you'll see we have a nice fluid group of 3 growing text inputs. And I found that to be really helpful. You can use the same technique if you just want containers that scale proportionately versus hard on one side and that type of thing. So that's, to me, a really useful technique. Let's move on to widget skins. I'll close out these files. Go back to the slides. What do we have to say about widget skins? Oh, Widget API. I didn't do a slide for widget skins. Let's just do a quick demo on widget skins. I'm going to be the first to say that right now, widget skins need a bit of work. However, they do work for the most part. Let's take a button and we're going to skin this button. So what is a widget skin? A widget skin is a way for you to create a CSS style that can easily be applied to other widgets of the same type. So I'm going to take this button and we're going to create a style. So let's do the background. We'll just make it fade from black into a dark gray. Sorry, I have to hit OK when I do the colors. Okay, and then let's change the text color to white. And let's take off the text shadow. Okay, so we have a nice looking button. What you do is you select the widget to take the sample from, right click, and go select, or I guess it's option click if you, option or control click if you haven't enabled right clicking, and save as widget skin. We'll call this black button. Hit OK. Now the thing to know is this button still has all the styles on it. It does not have the widget skin applied. You can see, or it does have it applied. So I'm going to clear off these styles just to clean up the CSS in the ID selector. So now we have a button with the skin black button. If we were to pull on another button, we can now easily style this by clicking on it, going to skins, and just selecting black button out of the menu. So save that and run it, and you can see that it works. Now here's the beauty of it, is it stores widget skins in the application.css. You can see it right here. First tip I would give you is if you want to improve the reliability of widget skins, and I believe that this probably will be something that will be fixed in the generated code, is just add that WAF body. That's something you can do if you're finding that it's inconsistent. For buttons, it's not a problem, but when you get into the grid and other things, that will solve some of your issues. But you can see here, now we can change elements of that button, or that skin. Let's just change it slightly to 230s. Go back to the browser. When we reload, you can see there wasn't much of a change there. Let's go 23. That will make a big difference. And reload. And you can see the text color has changed in every one of the instances that has that widget. So widget skins are specific per widget. So you'd have button widget skins, you would have container widget skins, and so on. It's per container. So that's widget skins in a nutshell. Let's go to next topic, the Widget API. A lot of the Widget API can be utilized to create more robust and more dynamic user interface. Some widgets, I'm going to be showing you only generic API functions, but some widgets have specific API functions. You know, the images and combo boxes, they all may have functions of their own that are specific to that widget. So you want to look at the documentation to see what different widgets offered. So let's take a look at Widget API. So I'll go into API review, and all I've done, I had a more interesting layout before, so let's create a more interesting layout. This will be container 2, and let's take a button, and that is button 1. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to demo this pretty much in the console here. So as I showed you before, let's take container 1, which is labeled there, container 1, and that gives us reference to the widget, as you probably know. Container1.hide. So you've got show, hide, and toggle. Container1.show and container1.toggle. Now toggle will just do the opposite of what's there now, so we can toggle all day. So that's visibility. That's important to an interface. Now with show, hide, toggle, there is an option in the hide where you can specify if it's display none or visibility hidden. And those do different things, in particular if you're using the natural flow of the document. What else can we do here? Let's talk about, we already did enable and disable. Oh, sorry, it is already enabled, so let's disable. So there you go. What happens to a button if we disable it? So button1.disable, and you can see. So widgets, if it's applicable, they have an enable, disable, and that's things that you can apply this code at any point in your application to create a dynamic layout, no page loads or anything like that. You can also do things like button1 dot set width, and you pass it a pixel value. Let's go 400, and it changes the size. So let's enable that again. There you go. So you've got set width, you've got set height. You also have button 1, and these are all sizing concerns. So if you're resizing, perhaps you have different parts of your interface that you want to resize on the fly. These are the API calls that you would use. So set left, let's make 100. You can see it's just moving the left to the left. So you've got set left, set right, set top, and set bottom. Let's enable container 1. I'm going to clear this. So enable. And now let's take a look at, let me get an idea what these IDs are. Text field 1, text field 2, text field 3, etc. So let's take a look at text field 2 dot has focus false. Let's try it now. I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this because I'm using, so let's do a button here. In this button, let's do that exact same code, because what's happening is it's losing focus. And I think even the button, probably the button's going to take focus as well. Anyways, let's try this. Alert if it has focus. Go back, reload. So it has focus now. No. So anyways, it lost focus when I click the button. But so it has focus. Will tell you if the text has focus or not. So perhaps you're doing that when you change a data source element. You're checking if a certain widget interface element has focus. Another thing you can do is, let's take text field 1. and we can check what its parent is. Get parent. And you can see that it's bringing back a reference to container 1. So you have ID container 1. You're able to find out what the current parent of that widget is. And likewise, we could do the same thing, except you can set parent and set it to the widget reference of container 2, which I think is the other container. There we go. Now, it didn't pull the label with it, so you would want to do that as well. But you can move widgets between parents. You can find out what parents are owned by different widgets, and that gives you a lot of flexibility as far as making your layout responsive. Now let's go through some additional material, mostly jQuery. And I've got a slide on that. And this is our last topic here. So jQuery, it's built in jQuery, and actually jQuery UI are both built into the WAF. So you have them by default. And this is, they're extremely strong when it comes to selectors and DOM manipulation. So when it's very good at selecting a group or single element out of the DOM and then applying manipulations to those. It's quite easy to figure out. It's well documented, and I'll show you the jQuery documentation site after these examples. And to me, it's the second step when you're searching for functionality. The first step is you want to go to native Wakanda functions. And then the next step, if you can't find it in that feature set, is go take a look at jQuery. And jQuery has a lot of functionality. A lot of it is available in Wakanda. So before you go into really hacking, either with native JavaScript or other mechanisms, I would recommend you try jQuery and see if you can accomplish what you want using that library. So let's take a look at some jQuery examples, and these are just some real-world examples of how jQuery solved some issues to me, or for me. So let's run this page. I've got it all set up pretty much. So one thing that's useful is you can dynamically set CSS, inline CSS using jQuery. So if we do, we go to Elements and grab this image here, you can see that within here, there's an image that has the height 100. So I set this in Wakanda Studio to be, I forget what the setting was, to height. So you've got to height, to width, to container, and different sizing things. There's no Wakanda API yet that allows you to change that that property. So what I've done is I went in here and I looked at, okay, what's the difference between fitting it to the container and fitting it to the height? And what it was it was adding a style width 100% when you went to container. So what I've done is in this to container, I've just added some jQuery that adds an inline style. That's very simple. We'll look at the code. Okay, so to container. So what we did was we set the, now the width probably already was, or the height probably already was 100%, but so a jQuery selector looks like this. This is an ID selector for image1 space image. It's a lot like CSS selectors. And conversely, this is where we went and we go back to just doing it to height. So we can dynamically change the way that this image is displayed with jQuery. Next example, jQuery has a decent selection of effects. So we can fade out and we can fade in, and there's all kinds of options that you can do within that. Fading code is very simple as well. It's all in the same spot. So there's a look at the fade in. So it's just the selector for that ID. jQuery is a single $sign, fade in, and there's an option for slow. And then fade out is just the opposite. So that's jQuery effect. Multiple selection. This is a really great part of jQuery. is we can, in one line, select more than one element. So in Wakanda, there is no sort of fuzzy matching to bring up more than one element that I know of anyhow. Is with that click, I've styled 3 elements. And if you go to the code, you can see here what I've done is I've done a selector for IDs that start with form example. So in the form, each of these, let me just grab it down here. So each of these start with form example 1, 2, and 3. So that's how we grabbed all of those in one line, added some CSS to them, and it's real quick and easy to do that. So next example, let's close this. So here's the right side anchored split. So you can see I have a resizable, and it's traveling with the right side just the way it behaves when you create a left side. And this is the behavior that I know a lot of people have commented that they would like to have. So I'll show you how to do that using jQuery. It's a little bit longer script. It's right here. So basically we're setting up some variables that I use for calculations, the container width, the splitter position, the current position, and the width of that panel. From there, we're using the Wakanda set split position. You can actually dynamically set the position of the split. And here we are calling a jQuery event, the resize event on that container. So when that container is resized, we're going to call the resize split function, which is right here. And all we're doing is we're calculating, was the splitter dragged? If it is, then update where this, how wide the splitter is. And then we calculate the position, and we do a set split position, which is a Wakanda function. So this code here gets you that effect of a right anchored split. Alternative to this jQuery event, there is a Wakanda pass-through right here. So it's just a different syntax, but it's doing basically the same thing. It's a Wakanda function, add listener. You're going to add a listener to the resize jQuery event and call this function. Now you could also put your function right in here as such, and it would do the same thing. But just to prove to you that the syntax works as well, let's run it with that Wakanda syntax instead, and you can see it runs the exact same as before. So there's a right side splitter. Now I've got one last thing to show you is a minimum size to your application. So to me, when you have an application, there's a size that's a minimum that makes sense. For instance, if someone wants to run your application this size, most business web applications won't look terribly good at this size. So I think there's a choice you make as a designer. When do you set the minimum position? And you can see here, scroll bars are invoked when you have statically placed items. However, it makes it difficult for you to keep all the dynamic elements that we've been talking about, dynamic sizing and that in place if you're just going to place things statically. So I'm going to show you what I think is a good practice to do. Go into this minimum size. So the first thing you need to do is we need a container to basically contain the entire application. We're going to use this container as a constraint to signal to the browser when to invoke scroll bars. Okay, so save that. We're going to go to, let's go to the document events on load. And just because we're running out of time here, I'm going to copy and paste some code. And I'll read through it here. Okay, so we're setting up our minimum height and minimum width. Now, one thing I should show you is in our application CSS, I already had two classes set up, minimum height, minimum width. So we're mimicking those values, except I didn't. So 400 wide, or 400 high, 900 wide. And oops, did I do those backwards? Yep. So that's 900 pixels and 400 pixels. So those are fixed. So we have CSS classes that are the same as our minimum width and height. Then we're going to, we do a window resize event. This is a jQuery call. So when the window's resized, we're going to go through this series of if statements. And it says if the window width is less than the minimum width, then we're going to take that outer container, which is container 1, and apply a CSS. Oh, we didn't even need the CSS classes because I wasn't sure if I would have those explained. So ignore those. We're going to apply it inline here. So we're applying the CSS width, minimum width, plus the pixels as an inline style. And if the minimum width is not violated, then we'll just clear it out. And we're doing the same with the height. So let's save this. We'll run this layout. So you can see it's already, so we have no scroll bars. No, this isn't working. You know why? Because I have to select this container and it needs to grow with the document. So I should have done all 4 constraints. Now it's going to size with the window. Sorry about that. Let's reload. Okay, now it's the size of the window. We're going to go, and you'll see there we hit the horizontal constraint, and we can now scroll and see the entire application. And likewise, independently, we can do the vertical, and it implements when it's supposed to. So it allows you to set up, okay, if you go beyond this threshold, we're going to invoke scroll bars. So that's the information I have. I know my time's up as well. Let's make sure I do have a few more slides. No, I don't. Okay. So that is it. Again, I want to remind you that the next webinar, I believe it's next Thursday, very important. I'd like to see questions sent to me so I can get the best questions possible to Laurent and Ricardo. And until then, it's great talking to you, and we'll have this recording up very soon.
Hey, thanks very much, Greg. Great presentation as always. I have a handful of questions here if you want to go through a few of them before you go.
Sure. Yep.
All right. So first question, do you recommend jQuery over CSS for effects and animation?
I don't think there's necessarily, I don't think I'm qualified to give a recommendation sort of across the board like that. CSS effects probably at this point are not as widely supported cross-platform. The jQuery, they've spent a lot of time really making sure that it's browser compatible. So I know when I looked at CSS effects, it was pretty lean what worked on a lot of browsers. However, that being said, Wakanda and the framework has relatively high browser requirements as it is. So I think probably the CSS effects would be the better way to go because you're sticking with those web standards. However, if you find that it's flaky as far as support, then lean towards jQuery.
Great. Is there a way that we can use custom web fonts?
Yes. I haven't experimented with them much, but if you go into, let's go see where it is. So I'm in Studio here. Let's grab a text widget. And, oh, sorry. Yeah, here it is, web fonts. So there is, I have not played with these at all, but I know that you can use the Google fonts and that type of thing.
Okay, great. So talking about IDs makes the CSS file grow larger. Is there another alternative for this?
Currently, no,
Okay.
but I agree with this questioner completely. It'd be nice if there was a little more flexibility. See, and again, I'm not on the development team, so I can only speak from opinion of what I think is happening. There's always a place where you will want to apply styles specifically to one widget. And in that case, that's where an ID makes sense. Um, Beyond that, um, classes make sense. They're more flexible and they allow you more maneuverability. They allow you to do more of what you want to do. So I've made a couple proposals actually just in the last day or two how this can be done in a better way. And I don't know that my proposals are the best way, but anyhow, what I can say is the development team is actively looking at that, and I think there will be a lot better solutions to that in the very near future.
All right. Is it possible to move the index.css page into another folder or rename it?
Yep. The index ones, no. The generated ones are where they are. So these index that's generated by the properties panel need to stay put. However, you can go in this index.html, for instance. I could go here and make a new file. Where's file? And we could call it something.css, create. And now I can embed that. You see style sheets here. I'll add a style sheet to this page. I'll cancel and I'll just drag it in. Now, when you're adding custom CSS sheets, those can be anywhere in your web folder, but the generated ones do need to stay where they are. And like I said, don't edit these because it'll get overwritten.
Alrighty. How can someone delete a splitter inside a grid?
A splitter inside of a grid? I'm
Yes.
thinking, how can you remove a splitter from a container that you've implemented? I think the only thing you can do, I've not tried it, but let's try. Um, because basically what it's doing is it's making two containers. So if we took a container, and I don't think this is going to work, so my answer is probably going to be delete it and remake it. So let's go split vertically. So now we have three containers. My guess is you possibly can go to source mode and remove it in here. But realistically, I think your best course of action currently, there is no join that I know of, I guess is what I would say. So I would probably, my course of action would be, I would just delete it and make it again. And I would take the contents out, put them in a different container temporarily so that you're not having to remake all the contents again, and I would put them back in. And more than that, I would go to the components webinars we've done in the past, and I would get up and fresh on components so that you can easily move your different elements of your interface without having to do a lot of redesign.
All right. So for sake of time, I'm going to ask you one more question. I know there's a few other ones. So if anyone has any additional questions, please email them to us, and we'll be sure to get the answers to you. Or another place to go would be the forum. I think you get a lot of great answers by putting these questions up on the forum. But last question for you is, which development branch are you using?
Yeah, I had that. It's really recent. So there you go there.
Great. All right. Well, thank you very much, Greg. Appreciate it as always. Everyone else out there, expect an email coming from us probably towards the end of the day. Hopefully, this time we'll have a nice recording with that email, as well as an invitation to next Thursdays, which I think is going to be really great. So, thanks very much.